A billionaire thinks he can use a foreign language to strip a woman of her dignity, but he is about to learn that some people speak the language of power better than he ever could. You have seen arrogant men, but you have never seen a comeback like this. The woman he tried to bury is the only one who can save his empire. The crystal chandeliers of Lumiere Manhattan did not just light up the room, they exposed every flaw in the people sitting under them. Aaliyah adjusted her apron, her spine straight, moving through the sea of $1,000 suits with a grace that did not belong to a waitress. She was overqualified, a former top-tier linguistics student whose life had been derailed by a family crisis. But here she was, just a ghost in a uniform. That changed the moment Tiffany's glass of Cabernet hit the floor. The red wine did not just splash, it stained the white marble and Tiffany's $3,000 ivory pumps. Tiffany did not gasp in surprise, she smiled with pure malice. "You clumsy, incompetent brat, Tiffany," hissed her voice, cutting through the soft jazz like a serrated blade. "Do you have any idea what these cost? More than your entire family makes in a year." Aaliyah did not flinch. She saw the intentional tilt of the wrist before the glass fell. The glass was placed at the edge of the table, Mom. "I will call for a busser to clear the glass so no one gets hurt." Tiffany's face contorted. "You will do more than that. You will get on your knees and you will scrub this stain off my shoes right now. It is what you are built for, isn't it? Serving people who actually matter." The restaurant went quiet. The high society crowd leaned in, their eyes cold and hungry for a show. Aaliyah felt the heat rising in her chest, but she did not bend. She knew the New York labor laws, and more importantly, she knew her worth. "I am here to serve food, not to be your footstool," Aaliyah said, her voice low and steady. "If the shoes are damaged, the restaurant has insurance. But I will not be humiliated for your entertainment." Tiffany let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "Humiliated? Honey, you were born humiliated. Look at you." She turned to the man sitting across from her, a man whose presence felt like a cold front moving into the room. Grant Sterling, the youngest billionaire in the city, had not looked up from his phone once. His silence was more oppressive than Tiffany's shouting. He finally raised his head, his blue eyes as cold as the ice in his scotch. He did not look at Aaliyah like a human being, he looked at her like a bug on a windshield. "Tiffany, don't waste your breath," Grant said, his voice a smooth, dangerous baritone. "People like this don't understand English, unless it is on a paycheck. Let's see if she understands the language of the elite, or if she is just as uneducated as she looks." He leaned back, crossing his legs, and began to speak in a tongue he thought she would never decipher. Grant Sterling did not even look up from his phone, but the air around him grew heavy with a pressure that made it hard for anyone to breathe. He tapped his fingers rhythmically against the marble table, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Aaliyah as if she were nothing more than a piece of outdated furniture. A condescending smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth as he turned to Tiffany, telling her not to waste her breath on people who only understood English when it was printed on a paycheck. Suddenly his tone shifted into something sharp and dangerous. He began firing off a stream of rapid Mandarin with the flawless accent of the Beijing elite. He demanded a specific vintage of red wine from the Burgundy region, adding complex requirements about production years and storage temperatures that would make even a professional sommelier stumble. He finished his tirade with a sentence in classical Arabic, a blatant challenge stating that if she could not record this order perfectly in 30 seconds, she did not deserve to occupy the same room as him. The eyes of the business partners at the table shifted toward Aaliyah, filled with mockery as they waited for her to crumble. Tiffany crossed her arms in triumph, announcing that if Aaliyah got even one word wrong, Grant would buy the entire restaurant just to fire her within 5 minutes. In that moment, Aaliyah's past flashed through her mind like a slow-motion film. She remembered the nights spent as the top linguistics student in her class, serving as a high-level translator for diplomatic missions before her family's world was torn apart. She took a deep breath to steady her hands, feeling the quiet pride of the Robinson bloodline coursing through her veins. Aaliyah did not reach for the notepad on the table. Instead, she stood with her spine straight, and looked Grant directly in the eyes with a terrifying level of composure. A heavy silence smothered the restaurant as every diner held their breath to see how this black waitress would respond to the intellectual assault. Grant uncrossed his legs and glanced at the expensive watch on his wrist, reminding her that his time was worth more than her life, and she was wasting it. Tiffany added that Aaliyah probably did not even know which country Mandarin belonged to, so she might as well get on her knees and apologize now. But just as Grant began to stand up to end the charade, Aaliyah began to speak. Her voice was warm and resonant, and her Mandarin was so fluid and elegant that the Chinese business partners dropped their chopsticks in shock. She did not just repeat every wine Grant requested, she pointed out that the 1994 vintage he ordered had actually been compromised in global transit and advised him to switch to the 1996 for a superior experience. Grant Sterling froze in his seat, his face turning pale as he realized the pawn he intended to crush was actually the one controlling the entire board. Aaliyah stood as still as a statue as the silence in the restaurant grew heavy enough to crush a lesser person. She did not reach for the silver tray or the fallen glass. Instead, she drew in a breath that seemed to fill her with a hidden power. When she finally spoke, her voice did not carry the tremor of a servant, but the melodic precision of a scholar. She began to speak in Mandarin, and the sound was so flawless, so resonant, that it felt like the very walls of the restaurant had shifted from Manhattan to the heart of Beijing. She did not just repeat the order, she dissected it. She addressed the Chinese investors by their proper honorary titles with a level of respect that Grant had completely missed. She explained that the vintage Grant had requested was notorious for being overpriced and underperforming compared to the local reserve that was not even listed on the public menu. The two Chinese businessmen sitting across from Grant slowly lowered their wine glasses, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound respect. They looked at each other, then back at the woman in the simple black uniform, as if they were seeing a ghost. One of them began to laugh, a sound of genuine delight, and he responded to her in a dialect so specific and difficult that even Grant could not follow it. Aaliyah did not skip a beat. She replied with a witty observation about the history of the vineyard they were discussing, making the investors chuckle and nod vigorously. They were no longer looking at Grant. They were captivated by the woman Grant had just called uneducated. The power dynamic in the room flipped in a heartbeat. Grant was no longer the master of the table, he was an outsider in his own meeting. Grant felt a cold knot of fury tighten in his stomach. He had spent his entire life using his intellect as a weapon to make others feel small, and now a waitress he had intended to humiliate was making him look like a fool in front of the men holding the keys to his next billion-dollar deal. He watched as his partners leaned in to listen to Aaliyah's recommendations, their faces lit up with a warmth they had never shown him. Tiffany sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, her face turning a blotchy red as she realized her attempt to bury Aaliyah had backfired spectacularly. Every word Aaliyah spoke was a hammer blow to Grant's ego. He did not feel admiration, he felt a deep, burning resentment. To Grant, someone like Aaliyah was supposed to be a background character in his story, not the one who corrected his grammar and stole his spotlight. As Aaliyah finished her explanation and gracefully bowed to the guests, she finally turned her gaze to Grant. Her eyes were calm and clear, showing no sign of triumph, only a quiet dignity that stung him more than any insult could. The lead investor looked at Grant and praised him for having such an exceptionally cultured and brilliant staff member, but Grant could barely force a smile. He felt small. He felt exposed. In his mind, this was no longer about a spilled drink or a wrong order, it was a declaration of war. He decided right then that he would not just fire her, he would make sure she never found work in this city again. He would crush her spirit until she remembered exactly where he thought she belonged. Aaliyah saw the darkness in his eyes and knew that the real storm was only just beginning. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like it might shatter the expensive glassware on the table. Grant Sterling leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Aaliyah, not with admiration, but with a growing cold fury. He could not stand the fact that a waitress in a stained uniform had just commanded the respect of his most important investors. He decided to push the stakes even higher, shifting his strategy to a more aggressive intellectual assault. Without missing a beat, Grant switched to a rapid-fire, sophisticated French, describing the specific notes of oak and blackberry he expected in the next bottle. He intentionally used rare technical terms often reserved for master sommeliers, hoping to catch her in a moment of hesitation. He did not stop there, moving instantly into a stiff, formal German to discuss the legal fine print of the logistics contract they were supposed to be signing. He was talking faster now, his voice a sharp weapon designed to overwhelm and confuse. Aaliyah did not blink. She absorbed his words with a terrifying calmness that seemed to irritate Grant more than any verbal insult could. When he finally stopped, his chest heaving slightly from the effort, Aaliyah stepped forward. She responded first in French, her accent so pure and melodic that the entire room seemed to lean in. She did not just translate his request, she politely corrected him. She pointed out that the specific oak aging process he mentioned was actually unique to a different vineyard in a different region, and that the notes he was looking for would only be found in a bottle that Grant had failed to mention. Then she turned her attention to his German. With a surgeon-like precision, she highlighted a massive error in the way Grant had described the maritime liability clauses. She explained that his phrasing would leave Sterling Global exposed to millions in damages if a shipment were lost at sea. She offered the correct legal terminology in German, her voice steady and authoritative, as if she were a senior partner at a law firm rather than a boy-bon at a Manhattan restaurant. The silence that followed was absolute. The business partners were no longer just impressed, they were looking at Grant with a new sense of skepticism. They realized that the woman serving them understood the intricacies of their deal better than the man they were about to go into business with. Tiffany could feel the eyes of the other high society diners on her, and the heat of embarrassment burned through her skin. She was supposed to be the star of the night, the elegant bride to be of a billionaire, but she had been reduced to a background character by a woman she considered trash. Tiffany slammed her hand onto the table, making the silverware rattle. She screamed that she had seen enough and that Aaliyah was nothing but a manipulative social climber who was clearly trying to trap Grant with a cheap performance. Tiffany stood up, her face contorted with rage, and demanded that the manager be brought out immediately to throw Aaliyah into the street. She was no longer just angry, she was terrified, because for the first time in her life, she saw a woman who possessed a wealth that money could never buy. Tiffany could not stand the way the light caught the respect in the eyes of the Chinese investors as they looked at Aaliyah. Every time Aaliyah spoke a perfect sentence in a foreign language, it felt like a slap to Tiffany's face. She watched Grant fuming in silence, his pride wounded, and she knew she had to do something drastic to shift the power back to where it belonged. She needed to remind everyone that Aaliyah was nothing more than a common thief in a cheap uniform. Tiffany reached into her designer handbag, her fingers brushing against the cold, heavy metal of her custom diamond-encrusted watch. It was worth more than a year's salary for most people in this room, and it was the perfect bait for a trap that would destroy Aaliyah's life forever. The restaurant was buzzing with the sound of laughter and clinking glasses, but Tiffany was focused on one thing only. She waited for the perfect moment when the busser moved past, and the waiter at the next table blocked the line of sight from the main security camera. Aaliyah was leaning over to refill a water glass for one of the investors, her back turned to Tiffany, and her large apron pocket hanging slightly open. It was a window of only 3 seconds. Tiffany moved with the practiced stealth of a predator. She pretended to reach for her fallen napkin, leaning close to Aaliyah's side as she went down. In one swift, fluid motion, she dropped the diamond watch into the deep pocket of Aaliyah's apron. The fabric muffled the sound of the heavy jewelry landing. Tiffany stood back up, smoothing her dress and flashing a brilliant fake smile as if nothing had happened. Aaliyah felt a slight tug on her apron, but she assumed it was just the edge of the table or a passing guest. She was too focused on maintaining her professional composure while Grant's eyes burned holes into the back of her head. She finished the service and began to walk away toward the kitchen, unaware that she was carrying a ticking time bomb in her pocket. Tiffany waited exactly 1 minute, letting the anticipation build in her chest. Suddenly, she let out a piercing theatrical gasp that silenced the entire surrounding area. She began frantically patting her wrist and digging through her bag, her voice rising into a panicked shriek. "My watch is gone!" Tiffany screamed. "My family heirloom is gone! Someone at this table took it." She stood up and pointed her finger directly at Aaliyah, who had stopped in her tracks 10 feet away. Grant saw his opportunity to regain control. He stood up slowly, his voice booming with a dark authority. "Stop right there," he commanded Aaliyah. "Nobody leaves this floor until we find that watch." Aaliyah turned around, her face pale with confusion, but her eyes still holding that same steady fire. "I have not touched your jewelry, ma'am," she said firmly. But Tiffany was already moving toward her, accusing her of using her linguistic performance as a distraction to rob them blind. The trap was set and the jaws were closing. Tiffany demanded that Aaliyah empty her pockets right there in front of the richest people in Manhattan. Aaliyah reached into her apron pocket, her fingers closing around a cold, hard object she knew she had never put there. She realized in that instant that she was no longer fighting for a job, she was fighting for her freedom. The silence in the grand dining room was heavy and suffocating as Grant Sterling stood up, his presence like a dark cloud over the golden table. He did not shout, but his voice carried a terrifying authority that made every guest stop mid-bite and look toward them. "My wife-to-be just informed me that a diamond heirloom is missing, and the only person who has been within arm's reach of her handbag is standing right here," Grant said, his eyes locking onto Aaliyah with a cold, predatory stare. Aaliyah felt a chill run down her spine as she realized the trap had finally snapped shut. She stood her ground, her hands empty and visible, but the whispers from the surrounding tables were already branding her a criminal. "I have not touched anything that does not belong to me, sir," Aaliyah replied, her voice holding a steady dignity that only seemed to make Grant more aggressive. Grant let out a short, dry laugh that held no humor. "You think your fancy languages and your clever corrections make you one of us?" he sneered, stepping closer until he was inches from her face. "You are a waitress who got too comfortable, and now you have been caught." Tiffany was weeping theatrically into a silk napkin, claiming the watch was irreplaceable and begging Grant to do something. Grant turned to the restaurant manager and demanded that this woman be searched right here and now in front of everyone. Aaliyah's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew that New York law protected her from an illegal search by a private citizen, but she also knew that Grant Sterling owned half the precinct. "I will not be humiliated for a crime I did not commit," Aaliyah said, her voice ringing out so everyone could hear. "If you want to search me, call the police." Grant smiled as if he had been waiting for her to say those exact words. He pulled his phone from his pocket and told her that he had already called them 5 minutes ago. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors of Lumiere Manhattan swung open, and 2 uniformed officers from the NYPD marched into the room. The sight of the blue uniforms caused a fresh wave of murmurs to ripple through the elite crowd. Tiffany pointed a trembling finger at Aaliyah, shouting that she saw the girl fumbling with the clasp of her watch earlier. One of the officers, a man with a tired face and a heavy belt, approached Aaliyah and asked if she would consent to a voluntary search to clear things up. Aaliyah looked at Grant and saw the pure malice in his eyes. She realized that if she refused, she would look guilty, and if she agreed, she was walking straight into whatever Tiffany had planted on her. She reached into the deep pocket of her apron, and her fingers brushed against something cold, heavy, and metallic. Her blood ran cold. She knew with absolute certainty that the pocket had been empty 5 minutes ago. Before she could even speak, Tiffany lunged forward and grabbed Aaliyah's arm, screaming that she could see the diamond reflection in the fabric. The officer stepped in and reached into Aaliyah's pocket, pulling out the encrusted diamond watch for the entire world to see. A collective gasp went up from the diners. Grant looked at Aaliyah with a look of disgusted triumph. "You see," he told the officers. "This is what happens when you let people like this into a place like this. Take her away and make sure she stays behind bars where she belongs." Aaliyah felt the cold steel of the handcuffs click around her wrists, and for a moment the world went dark. She was being led out in front of the cameras and the elite. But as she passed Grant, she whispered one thing: "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The cold steel of the handcuffs snapped shut around Aaliyah's wrists with a sound that felt louder than any of the shouting in the room. The metal was biting into her skin, but she refused to wince or look down at her hands. She kept her chin high and her gaze fixed on a point just above Grant Sterling's head. As the officers began to lead her through the center of the dining room, the world around her seemed to slow down and blur into a haze of gold and white. In that moment of intense humiliation, a flood of memories she had tried so hard to bury came rushing back to the surface. She was no longer in a stained apron in a Manhattan restaurant. She was standing in the marble halls of the State Department, surrounded by world leaders and high-ranking diplomats. She remembered the weight of the headset around her ears and the intense focus required to translate delicate nuclear negotiations in real time. Aaliyah had been the youngest senior interpreter in the history of the Bureau. She had mastered 7 languages, not for show, but because she believed that communication was the only way to prevent conflict. She had traveled on Air Force One and sat in rooms where the fate of nations was decided. Her future had been bright, and her path to the top was guaranteed. But then the phone call came. Her mother had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of early-onset dementia, and there was no one else to provide the round-the-clock care she needed. The medical bills began to pile up faster than her government salary could cover. Aaliyah had made a choice that many in her position would never understand. She walked away from the corridors of power and the prestigious titles to return to New York. She took the job at Lumiere because the tips were fast and the flexible hours allowed her to be home for her mother's treatments. She had traded her suits for a service uniform and her voice for silence. Every day she swallowed her pride and listened to people like Grant and Tiffany talk down to her as if she were a ghost with no brain. She had endured their insults and their condescension because her mother was her priority, and she would do it all again. But as she was marched past the tables of wealthy diners who were recording her arrest on their phones, she felt a new kind of fire ignited in her chest. Grant Sterling thought he was arresting a thief, but he was actually declaring war on a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle a person with nothing but the truth. He saw a waitress who had failed a test of character, but Aaliyah saw a man who was about to lose everything he valued because he was too arrogant to see who was really standing in front of him. The officers reached the heavy oak doors, and the cool night air hit her face, the flashing red and blue lights of the squad car reflected in her dark eyes. She did not cry, and she did not beg for mercy. She knew that the diamond watch in her pocket was a lie, and she knew that the Sterling family empire was built on even bigger lies. As they pushed her into the back of the car, she looked out the window and saw Grant standing under the restaurant awning, straightening his tie with a look of smug satisfaction. Aaliyah leaned her head back against the seat and whispered a promise to the darkness. She had spent years translating the words of powerful men, and now she was going to make sure the world finally heard her own. The siren began to wail and the car pulled away, but the game was far from over. The officers gripped Aaliyah's arms and began to usher her toward the open door of the patrol car, but she stopped suddenly and dug her heels into the pavement. The flashing blue and red lights danced across her face, making her look like a statue carved from obsidian. Grant Sterling stood under the glowing marquee of the restaurant, adjusting his silk cuffs with a smug look of finality. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully buried a nuisance under the weight of a false felony. But Aaliyah turned her head slowly and looked him straight in the eyes, with a calm intensity that made the air around them turn cold. She did not scream, and she did not beg for her freedom. Instead, she leaned in just enough for Grant to hear her over the idling engine of the police cruiser. She began to speak in a language that sounded like dry leaves dancing over ancient stones. It was Yiddish, but not the common kind heard on the streets of New York. It was an archaic ceremonial dialect spoken only by the founding elders of the Sterling family, a secret tongue used to pass down the most private traditions of their lineage. Aaliyah spoke a single sentence that translated to the roots of the tree are rotted, and the house built on them shall return to the dust. Grant's hand froze on his cufflink, and the blood drained from his face so fast he looked like he had seen a ghost. His eyes widened and his breath hitched in his throat because there was no possible way this woman should know those words. That specific phrase was a warning passed from his grandfather to his father, and it had never been written down in any book or record. Grant felt a sudden wave of nausea as he realized that Aaliyah was not just a boyban, she was someone who had been inside the most sacred circles of his world. He tried to step forward to demand how she knew that language, but the officers were already pushing her into the back seat. Tiffany noticed the change in Grant and asked him what was wrong, but he could not answer her. His heart was hammering against his ribs as he watched the patrol car door slam shut. Aaliyah looked at him through the glass, her expression unreadable and her silence more terrifying than any threat. Grant stood there on the sidewalk of Manhattan, feeling a sudden and deep sense of dread. He had spent the entire night trying to prove that she was beneath him, but in one sentence she had proven that she knew secrets that could dismantle his entire legacy. As the police car pulled away into the night and the sirens began to wail, Grant realized that he had not just arrested a thief, he had invited a wolf into his fold. He looked down at his trembling hands and wondered if the empire he worked so hard to build was actually as stable as he thought. Tiffany was still complaining about her ruined shoes and the drama of the night, but her voice sounded like static in his ears. All he could hear was the echo of that ancient language and the cold promise of destruction that Aaliyah had left behind. He had tried to silence her, but her final words were a bell that he could not unring. The game had changed, and for the first time in his life, Grant Sterling was the one who was afraid of the dark. Grant Sterling sat at the head of the massive mahogany conference table in his private executive suite, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm against the polished wood. Across from him sat the representatives of the Al Maktoum Group, 3 men in tailored suits whose expressions were as unreadable as stone. This was the deal that was supposed to solidify Sterling's legacy, a multi-billion-dollar partnership for a sustainable energy grid in the Middle East. Grant had spent months preparing for this moment, but as he looked at the lead negotiator, Sheikh Ahmed, he felt a cold bead of sweat track down his spine. The air in the room was thick with a tension that even the high-end air filtration system could not scrub away. Grant began his presentation using the aggressive high-stakes vocabulary that had made him famous in the business world. He spoke about dominance market share and the inevitable expansion of Sterling Global. Suddenly, the tablet in the center of the table chimed with a low, urgent tone. Sheikh Ahmed did not look at Grant. He looked at his own device, and his brow furrowed in deep concentration. Grant felt his heart skip a beat as he saw the other 2 negotiators exchange a sharp glance. His own assistant leaned in and whispered that a high-priority encrypted email had just arrived from their primary independent consultant, a linguist known only as Shadow. This was the anonymous expert Grant had relied on for years to navigate the cultural and linguistic nuances of his international deals. Grant pulled up the message on his own screen, and the words felt like a physical blow to his chest. The email was written in a dialect of Arabic so ancient and formal that Grant could only recognize its authority. The message stated that the partnership was being terminated, effective immediately, due to a severe breach of character and a fundamental lack of respect for global heritage. The anonymous author revealed that they had witnessed Grant Sterling's behavior firsthand at a restaurant in Manhattan and concluded that a man who snook a person based on their appearance and language was not a man worthy of their trust. The email detailed the exact conversation Grant had with Aaliyah, including the technical errors he made and the arrogance he displayed. Grant felt the world tilting on its axis. He realized that the waitress he had arrested and humiliated was the very same Shadow whose expertise had built his international reputation. Sheikh Ahmed stood up slowly, closing his leather portfolio, with a finality that sounded like a coffin lid. "We value honor above all else, Mr. Sterling the Sheik," said his voice a low rumble of disappointment. "It appears your private face is quite different from your public one. We will be seeking a partner who understands that the soul of a deal is found in the way you treat the least among us." Grant tried to speak to offer an apology or a defense, but his throat was as dry as the desert sand. He watched in stunned silence as the men who held his future in their hands walked out of the room without looking back. He was left alone in his glass tower staring at the screen where Aaliyah had just dismantled his empire with a few perfectly chosen words. The billionaire who thought he was untouchable realized he was now the one begging for a seat at the table. The silence in the executive office was shattered by the frantic chirping of the primary security console. Grant Sterling stared at his monitors as the screens turned a deep blood red one by one. His chief technical officer burst into the room, his face pale and his hands trembling as he delivered the news that every CEO fears. Sterling Global was under a massive, sophisticated cyber attack, but it was not a typical data breach. The attacker was not just stealing files, they were decrypting the most sensitive archives of the company archives that were protected by a proprietary, multi-layered linguistic code. Grant felt his stomach drop as he realized that the encryption keys were based on the same ancient dialects he had used to humiliate Aaliyah at the restaurant. Whoever was inside the system understood the nuances of those languages better than the machines did. The CTO explained that the hacker was moving through the servers with an eerie surgical precision, bypassing firewalls as if they were made of glass. They were targeting the black box files, the secret records of Grant's father, and the original land acquisition contracts that built the Sterling Empire. Grant pushed his technician aside and began to scroll through the activity logs himself. His heart hammered against his ribs as he saw the decryption notes appearing on the screen in real time. The notes were written in a mixture of French, German, and Mandarin, highlighting every ethical violation and every legal loophole his family had ever exploited. The hacker left a digital signature at the end of every decrypted file, a small icon of a scale being balanced. Grant realized with a jolt of pure terror that this was not a random act of digital hijacking. It was a targeted execution. Every secret he had ever kept, every bribe his father had ever paid, and every life they had stepped on to reach the top was being pulled into the light. The system was being dismantled from the inside out by someone who knew exactly where the skeletons were buried because they spoke the language of the dead. Grant tried to initiate a manual override, but the system rejected his biometric scan. A message appeared on the main wall of the office in bold white letters against the red background. "You thought your power was built on silence, but you forgot that every silence eventually speaks." Grant sank into his leather chair, the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on him like a physical load. He looked at the chaos on the screens and saw the face of the waitress in the back of the police car. He had called her a nobody and a ghost, but now that ghost was haunted his entire legacy. His company was hemorrhaging market value by the second as the decrypted files began to leak onto the dark web. The billionaire who thought he was a master of the world realized he was just a man in a glass house and someone was throwing stones in every language he had ever used to hurt people. He was no longer just losing a deal. He was losing his name, and there was no firewall in the world that could stop a truth that had been silenced for too long. He picked up his phone to call his lawyers, but his hands were shaking so hard he dropped it on the floor. The scales were balancing, and he was on the wrong side of the weight. Tiffany sat in the plush velvet armchair of Grant's private office, her legs crossed, and a sharp predatory smile playing on her lips. The chaos of the cyber attack was still visible on the flickering monitors behind her, but she looked entirely unbothered by the collapse of the Sterling Empire. Grant stood by the window, his back to her, clutching a glass of scotch so tightly his knuckles were white. He was waiting for her to offer some word of comfort or a lead on a lawyer, but when she spoke, her voice was as cold as a winter morning in the Atlantic. She did not ask how he was or if the company could be saved. Instead, she pulled a thick manila envelope from her designer bag and tossed it onto the mahogany desk with a dull thud. Grant turned around, his brow furrowed in confusion as he reached for the envelope. Inside were dozens of internal memos, bank statements, and offshore wire transfer records that he thought had been shredded years ago. They were the smoking gun of a massive tax evasion scheme his father had started and Grant had perfected. Tiffany leaned back, her eyes sparkling with a cruel light, as she told him that she had been collecting these for months, just in case he ever got cold feet about their future. She was no longer the doting wife-to-be, or the elegant socialite. She was a blackmailer who had seen an opportunity to strike while he was at his weakest. Tiffany told him plainly that the wedding would happen tomorrow morning at City Hall, and he would sign over 50% of his personal liquid assets to her as a prenuptial gift. Grant felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he realized the woman he was about to marry was just as dangerous as the enemies attacking his servers. He called her a monster, but Tiffany only laughed, a jagged sound that echoed off the high ceilings. She reminded him that in their world, monsters were just people who knew how to win. She gave him an ultimatum that was as sharp as a guillotine blade. Either he married her and gave her the legal shield of a spouse to protect her own interests, or she would hand that envelope directly to the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation before the sun came up. Grant looked at the woman he thought he loved and saw only a stranger holding a knife to his throat. The billionaire who had spent his life controlling everyone around him was now trapped between a brilliant waitress seeking justice and a vengeful fiancé seeking a fortune. Tiffany stood up and adjusted her pearls, telling him that he had 1 hour to make his choice. She warned him that if he tried to call security or hide the files, she had digital copies stored in 3 different countries, ready to be released with a single click. As she walked toward the door, she stopped and looked at the red screens of the security breach. She told him that she did not care if Sterling Global burned to the ground as long as she walked away with her pockets full of the ashes. Grant was left alone in the red glow of his office, realizing that his wealth had not bought him a kingdom. It had only built a more expensive prison. The woman he had used to humiliate Aaliyah was now the one holding the keys to his cage. Grant Sterling stood in the middle of his wrecked office, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The threats from Tiffany were still ringing in his ears, but a different kind of noise was beginning to drown them out. It was the memory of Aaliyah's voice speaking that ancient secret Yiddish dialect. He could not stop thinking about the look in her eyes as the police car pulled away. It was not the look of a defeated criminal, but the look of a hunter who had just successfully lured their prey into a trap. Grant began to realize that everything that had happened since that night, the failed deal with the Middle East, the devastating cyber attack, and even Tiffany's sudden betrayal, felt connected by a single invisible thread. He looked at the empty space on his desk where Tiffany's watch had been, and a cold realization washed over him. He had been so blinded by his own arrogance that he had missed the most obvious truth of all. Grant grabbed his coat and rushed out of the building, ignoring the shouts of his frantic assistants. He drove through the rain-soaked streets of Manhattan, his mind racing as fast as the tires on the pavement. He arrived at the precinct and demanded to speak with the officer in charge of Aaliyah's case. He needed to see her. He needed to look her in the eye and demand to know who she really was and how she knew the secrets of his family. But when he reached the front desk, the sergeant on duty looked at him with a tired, bored expression. He told Grant that he was too late. Grant felt his heart drop into his stomach as he asked if she had been processed or moved to the city jail. The sergeant shook his head and explained that Aaliyah had been released over an hour ago. Grant froze his hand, gripping the cold metal of the precinct counter. He asked who had posted her bail, assuming it must have been a small local group or perhaps a public defender. The sergeant glanced at the digital file on his screen and his eyebrows shot up in surprise. He told Grant that an anonymous wire transfer had arrived within 20 minutes of her arrival. The bail had been set at an astronomical amount because of the value of the diamond watch, but someone had paid the full $500,000 in cash without hesitation. There were no names on the paperwork, only an encrypted corporate entity based out of the Cayman Islands. Grant felt a wave of dizziness hit him. No ordinary waitress has access to $500,000 in liquid cash in the middle of the night. He walked out of the police station and stood under the flickering streetlights, the rain soaking through his expensive wool coat. He realized that the woman he had tried to crush was not a victim at all. She was a ghost, with a bank account larger than some of his subsidiaries. Whoever had bailed her out had enough power to move through the legal system like a knife through butter. Grant looked at the dark windows of the skyscrapers surrounding him and felt a sudden intense sense of isolation. He had spent his life thinking he was the one holding the leash, but now he felt like he was the one being hunted. He realized that Aaliyah had allowed herself to be arrested just to see how he would react, and now she was out there in the dark waiting for him to make his next move. The billionaire who thought he was a king realized he was just a pawn in a game he did not even understand. Grant Sterling pushed through the heavy oak doors of Lumiere Manhattan, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped animal. The restaurant was closed for a private cleaning session, and the dimmed crystal chandeliers cast long, jagged shadows across the empty tables. He ignored the confused looks from the janitorial staff and headed straight for the manager's office. He did not want the standard security footage because he knew those cameras had blind spots that his father had intentionally designed. Grant reached under the mahogany molding of the host stand and pulled out a small, encrypted drive that connected to a hidden high-definition thermal camera he had installed himself for personal security. He needed to see the truth without any filters or edits. He sat in the dark office, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his hollow eyes. He rewound the footage to the exact moment Tiffany had claimed her watch was stolen. On the screen, the scene played out in slow motion. He saw Aaliyah standing with her back turned professional and focused on her work. Then he saw Tiffany. His stomach did a slow, sickening roll as he watched his fiancée reach into her designer bag with the practiced movements of a professional thief. She didn't look panicked or distressed. She looked calculating. Tiffany waited for the buzzer to block the view of the ceiling camera, then leaned in close to Aaliyah. With a swift, cold motion, she dropped the diamond watch into Aaliyah's apron pocket. Grant watched the clip again and again, his breath hitching in his throat. There was no mistake. Tiffany had not lost her heirloom. She had used it as a weapon to destroy an innocent woman's life just because her ego had been bruised. He saw the smirk on Tiffany's face as she stood back up, the same smirk she had used when she told him she loved him. The betrayal tasted like ash in his mouth. He realized that the woman he was supposed to marry was a predator who had orchestrated a felony in front of a room full of witnesses just to prove she was superior. He felt a wave of hot shame wash over him as he remembered how he had stood there and let the police concte Aaliyah while he insulted her family and her dignity. He leaned back in the chair, the silence of the office pressing in on him. He had spent his whole life thinking he was the master of the game, but he had been a blind fool, led by a woman who was bleeding him dry. Grant looked at the frozen frame of Aaliyah's face on the screen. Even in the grainy footage, her eyes held a strength that he now realized was a warning. He had helped Tiffany bury a woman who was worth 10 of her, and now that woman was out there with his secrets and his power. The first layer of his life had been stripped away, revealing a rot that went deeper than he ever imagined. Grant grabbed the drive and walked out into the cold New York night, knowing that his alliance with Tiffany was dead, but his nightmare with Aaliyah was only just beginning. He had to find her before she decided to burn everything he had left. Grant Sterling sat at his desk staring at the glowing red numbers on his dual monitors as they plummeted toward zero. He tried to authorize a wire transfer to cover the mounting legal fees, but the system pushed back with a cold mechanical error message. He hit the intercom and screamed for his finance director, but the man stumbled into the office looking like he had seen a ghost. "Sir, every single one of our corporate accounts has been flagged and frozen," the director said, his voice trembling. Grant felt a surge of adrenaline and fury as he demanded to know how any bank could freeze the assets of Sterling Global without a court order. The director placed a tablet on the desk showing a legal injunction from the New York State Supreme Court and the Treasury Department. The freeze was not because of the cyber attack or the tax evasion files. It was a formal title dispute claim that had been dormant for 2 decades. The claimant was a newly registered entity called the Robinson Legacy Group. Grant felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead as he recognized the name. 20 years ago, his father had acquired the massive block of land in Harlem that now housed the Sterling World headquarters. Grant had always been told the land was bought fairly from a struggling family business. But as he scrolled through the injunction, he saw a series of forged signatures and evidence of a forced foreclosure that had been hidden behind layers of shell companies. The claim stated that the original owners, the Robinson family, had never legally relinquished their rights to the property. The documents attached to the frieze were incredibly detailed, containing original property deeds and private correspondences between Grant's father and a crooked city official. Grant realized that if the title was proven to be fraudulent, then Sterling Global did not own the land beneath its own feet. Every building, every lease, and every dollar generated on that property would be considered a fruit of the poisonous tree. The billionaire who thought he owned the skyline suddenly felt like a squatter in his own office. He tried to call his lead counsel, but his phone line was busy with calls from the board of directors who were already seeing the news break on the financial networks. The anchor on the screen was talking about a historic injustice being corrected and a local family finally coming for what was theirs. Grant looked at the name Aaliyah Robinson on his private investigator's report, and the pieces finally clicked into place. The waitress was not just a linguist, she was the daughter of the man his father had destroyed to build this tower. She was not just seeking a job or a payout, she was reclaiming her heritage. Every sinook he had thrown at her, every attempt to make her feel small, was now being answered by a legal tidal wave that threatened to wash his entire legacy into the Atlantic. He realized that while he was playing a game of corporate chess, Aaliyah was playing a game of historical justice. He was no longer just fighting for his money, he was fighting a ghost who had come back to take the very ground he stood on. The billionaire realized that the most dangerous person in the world is someone who has nothing left to lose and the truth on their side. The cold realization hit Grant Sterling like a physical blow to the chest as he stared at the final line of the diplomatic telegram. The Middle Eastern Investment Group had made their position absolute, stating that they would only return to the negotiating table if the consultant known as Shadow was present to personally vet the ethics of the deal. Grant felt a wave of nausea because he finally understood that Shadow was not a ghost or a distant expert, but the very woman he had humiliated and thrown into the back of a police car. He had spent his entire life thinking he was the one who decided who was important, and now his entire future depended on the forgiveness of a waitress in Harlem. He grabbed his coat and rushed out of the Sterling Tower, his mind a chaotic storm of regret and desperation. He drove himself to the precinct again, but this time he was not there to press charges, he was there to beg for information. The sergeant behind the desk looked at Grant with a mixture of pity and boredom, informing him that Aaliyah Robinson had not just been bailed out, she had been completely cleared. The diamond watch had been found to have only Tiffany's fingerprints on the clasp, and the internal mechanism proving it was a planted setup. Grant felt the world tilting on its axis as the officer told him that Aaliyah had filed a countersuit for malicious prosecution and civil rights violations before she even left the building. The billionaire who thought he owned the city realized he was now the one being hunted by the very legal system he had tried to weaponize. Grant spent the next 6 hours tracking every lead until he found himself standing in front of a modest brick row house in a quiet corner of Harlem. This was the address listed on Aaliyah's employment file, but the house did not look like the home of a struggling servant. It was pristine with a high-end security system and a garden that looked better tended than his own estate. As he approached the front door, it opened before he could even knock. Aaliyah stood there, no longer wearing the stained apron of Lumiere Manhattan. She was dressed in a sharp-tailored silk suit in a deep shade of emerald, and her hair was styled with a professional elegance that radiated power. She looked Grant Sterling in the eyes, and for the first time he saw not a waitress, but the rightful heir to a legacy his family had tried to erase. Aaliyah did not wait for him to speak. She told him in a voice as steady as a heartbeat that his time was up and his empire was built on sand. She revealed that the Al Maktoum family were not just business partners to her, but personal friends she had saved during a diplomatic crisis years ago. They were not here to help Grant. They were here to help her reclaim the Robinson land and dismantle Sterling Global piece by piece. Grant tried to offer an apology, but Aaliyah stopped him with a single raised hand. She told him that an apology without restitution is just another lie, and he was about to learn exactly how much it cost to steal a family's soul. She closed the door in his face, leaving the youngest billionaire in New York standing alone on the sidewalk, realizing that the woman he tried to make invisible was now the only thing he could see. Grant Sterling parked his sleek black luxury sedan on a corner in Harlem that looked nothing like the polished streets of the Upper East Side. He stepped out onto the pavement, his Italian leather shoes gleaming awkwardly against the cracked concrete. The air here smelled different, rich with the scent of spices, exhaust fumes, and the energy of a community that lived loud and unapologetic. Grant checked the address on his phone one last time, feeling the weight of 100 eyes on him. He was a man who usually commanded attention, but here the attention felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest. A group of older men sitting on a stoop nearby stopped their game of dominoes to watch him. Their silence was not deferential, it was skeptical. Grant cleared his throat and approached them, asking if they knew where he could find Aaliyah Robinson. One of the men, a silver-haired elder with a cane, looked Grant up and down, slowly taking in the tailored suit, the expensive watch, and the nervous sweat beading on Grant's forehead. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he turned to his friend and made a joke in a slang Grant could not quite parse, causing the whole group to erupt in laughter. Grant felt a flush of irritation rise in his neck. He repeated the question, his voice sharper this time, demanding an answer. The elder stopped laughing and leaned forward, his expression hardening. "You are far from your tower, Mr. Sterling," the man said, recognizing the billionaire from the news. "People like you only come here to take something or break something. Which one is it today?" Grant was taken aback. He was used to being recognized with awe, not disdain. He tried to offer them money for the information, pulling a crisp $100 bill from his wallet. The atmosphere shifted instantly from wary to hostile. The men looked at the money as if it were contaminated. "Put that away before you embarrass yourself," the elder said, his voice low and dangerous. "Aaliyah is not someone you can buy, and neither are we. Her house is down the block, but I suggest you walk carefully. The sidewalk here remembers everything your family took." Grant shoved the money back into his pocket, his hands shaking slightly. He realized that his wealth was useless here. In this neighborhood, respect was the only currency that mattered, and he was currently bankrupt. He walked down the street feeling like an intruder in a foreign land. Children playing double dutch stopped to stare at him, and a woman watching from her window shook her head as he passed. He could hear the whispers trailing behind him, whispers that called him a vulture and a thief. For the first time in his life, Grant Sterling felt small. He was not the master of the universe here. He was just a trespasser walking on land that his father had stolen. He reached the modest brick row house at the end of the block and hesitated before the iron gate. The humiliation he had felt at the restaurant was nothing compared to the silent judgment of an entire community that knew exactly who he was and what he represented. He took a deep breath and rang the bell, knowing that the woman on the other side held the power to destroy him or save him, and he had absolutely no leverage left to use. Grant Sterling stepped into the Harlem Community Library and felt the heavy silence press against his eardrums. It was a world away from the glass and steel of Midtown where he felt like a giant. Here, among the rows of peeling paint and towering shelves of worn books, he felt like an intruder. The air smelled of dust and history, and the kind of quiet resilience that money could not buy. He spotted Aaliyah sitting at a scarred wooden table in the back corner, surrounded by stacks of reference books that looked older than the country itself. She did not look up as he approached, but he knew she felt his presence, because her spine stiffened just a fraction. Grant reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp, white envelope that felt heavier than lead. He had spent the entire car ride over convincing himself that this was just a business transaction. Everyone has a price, he told himself, and $5 million was a price that could buy a lot of forgiveness and a lot of silence. He placed the check on the table between them, his hand trembling slightly. The number was written in bold black ink, followed by 6 zeros. Aaliyah finally raised her eyes from her book. They were dark and unreadable, deeper than the ocean, and twice as cold. Grant cleared his throat and spoke in a voice that tried to sound authoritative, but came out sounding desperate and thin. $5 million tax-free, he said, his words echoing in the empty aisle. This is more than you or your family will ever see in 10 lifetimes. It is enough to fix this neighborhood. Take it and drop the lawsuit. Take it and disappear. Aaliyah looked at the check, then back at him. She did not gasp and she did not smile. She reached out and picked up the slip of paper, holding it delicately between her fingers, as if it were a dirty napkin that had blown onto her table. Grant felt a surge of relief wash over him, thinking he had finally won. He started to exhale, but the breath caught in his throat as Aaliyah slowly and deliberately tore the check down the middle. The sound of the ripping paper was louder than a gunshot in the quiet library. She tore it again and again, her eyes never leaving his face, until the $5 million was nothing but a pile of worthless confetti in her palm. She stood up and walked over to a metal trash can near the stacks and let the pieces fall from her fingers like dead leaves. Grant stood there, his mouth slightly open, his mind unable to process what he had just seen. He had never met anyone who could throw away a fortune without blinking. Aaliyah turned back to him, and her voice was low and dangerous, vibrating with a controlled fury. You think you can buy my silence with the same money your father stole from my grandfather? She asked. You think my language and my heritage are that cheap? You stood in that restaurant and mocked the way I speak and the way I look, but now you are trying to pay for it like it is a commodity on the stock market. Keep your money, Grant. I do not want your charity, I want your ruins. I want you to feel exactly what it is like to have everything taken from you by a man who thinks he is a god. She sat back down and returned to her book, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than a bad memory. Grant stood frozen in the aisle, realizing for the first time that there are things in this world that are more powerful than a bank account. He was not negotiating a deal, he was staring into the face of his own destruction, and he was completely unarmed. Tiffany Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of the penthouse, watching the rain lash against the glass like bullets. The city lights below were a blur of gold and red, but she saw none of it. Her eyes were glued to the tablet in her hand, where a small, pulsing dot showed the location of Grant's car. He was deep in Harlem, parked in front of a community library. Tiffany felt a scream rising in her throat, but she swallowed it down, turning her fear into a cold, hard resolve. She knew exactly who he was meeting. Aaliyah Robinson was not just a nuisance anymore. She was a cancer that was eating away at everything Tiffany had built. Tiffany swiped the screen to open a secure encrypted messaging app. She had suspected for weeks that Aaliyah knew too much, but the events of the last 24 hours confirmed her worst nightmares. It was not just about the stolen land or the tax evasion. Tiffany unlocked a hidden file on her device and stared at a digital copy of a birth certificate from 5 years ago. It was the only proof in existence of the switch she had orchestrated in the maternity ward. Grant believed that their son William was his biological heir, but Tiffany knew the truth. Her own child had been born stillborn, and she had paid a corrupt nurse to swap him with a healthy baby born in the next room. That baby belonged to a cousin of the Robinson family. If Aaliyah had figured out the land fraud, she was only one step away from uncovering the stolen heir. Tiffany realized she could not let Grant walk out of that library with Aaliyah. If they talked long enough, Aaliyah would connect the dots, and Tiffany would not just lose her money, she would go to prison for kidnapping and fraud. She pressed the call icon on the screen and waited. The line clicked open, but there was no greeting on the other end, only the sound of heavy breathing and the hum of a car engine. "I have a job for you, Tiffany," said her voice devoid of any emotion. "The target is at the Harlem Community Library. She is with Sterling right now. I need you to wait until he leaves." The voice on the other end was rough and distorted. You want me to scare her? Tiffany laughed, a dry, bitter sound. No, I do not want her scared. I want her silent. Permanently. She has documents that belong to me, and she is spreading lies about my family. Make it look like a robbery gone wrong. This is a bad neighborhood, so nobody will ask questions if a woman gets shot for her purse. She paused, watching the dot on the screen, as Grant began to move away from the library. He is leaving now, Tiffany whispered. The girl is alone. Do it. She ended the call and tossed the tablet onto the silk sofa. Her hands were trembling, but not from guilt. She was shaking with the adrenaline of survival. She had done terrible things to secure her place in high society, and she was not going to let a waitress in a cheap suit take it all away. Tiffany poured herself a glass of vintage champagne and walked back to the window. She imagined Aaliyah packing up her books in that dusty library, unaware that a predator was waiting in the shadows. Tiffany took a sip of the cold wine and told herself that this was necessary. In the world of billionaires, there are no innocent players, only winners and casualties. Tonight, Aaliyah Robinson was going to be a casualty, and the secret of the stolen baby would be buried with her in the wet pavement of Harlem. Grant turned to leave the library, his ego bruised, and his $5 million check lying in pieces in the trash can. The silence of the room was suddenly broken by the heavy crash of the front door swinging open against the wall. A figure stepped out of the rain and into the dim light, wearing a dark hoodie pulled low over his face and keeping one hand buried deep in his jacket pocket. Grant felt a prickle of instinct warning him that this was not a patron coming to return a book. The man moved with a predatory speed, heading straight for the back corner where they stood. Grant stepped forward, his business instincts kicking in, assuming this was a robbery that could be solved with a wallet. He raised his hands and began to say that he had cash, but the man did not stop. He pulled a suppressed pistol from his pocket and raised it not at Aaliyah, but directly at the space between them. The air in the library turned into ice. Grant froze. He had faced hostile boardrooms and angry shareholders, but he had never looked down the barrel of a gun. The gunman lunged forward, his finger tightening on the trigger. In that split second, Grant closed his eyes, waiting for the end, but the shot never came. Instead, he heard the sickening crunch of bone hitting bone. He opened his eyes to see Aaliyah moving like a blur of motion. She had not cowered under the table. She had stepped into the line of fire. Her left hand had deflected the gun barrel upward, while her right palm struck the assailant's chin with a force that snapped his head back. It was not the flailing of a terrified woman, it was the calculated efficiency of a soldier. Grant watched in shock as Aaliyah twisted the man's wrist with a precise, brutal torque that forced the weapon to clatter to the floor. She used the attacker's own momentum to slam him face first into the heavy oak table, sending books flying everywhere. The hitman groaned and scrambled backward, his nose broken and his eyes filled with fear. He realized he had walked into a trap and fled out the door, disappearing into the rainy Harlem night. Aaliyah stood there, breathing hard, but perfectly composed, smoothing her emerald suit as if she had just swatted a fly. Grant stared at her, his mouth dry. He asked her where a waitress learned to fight like a special forces operative. Aaliyah picked up her bag and looked at him coldly. She told him that her father did not just leave her a lawsuit, he taught her how to survive men who try to take everything from her. She then pointed to the gun on the floor and told Grant to look closely. It was a custom model, the kind only security contractors for high-level executives use. She told him that bullet was not meant for a robbery, it was a cleanup job. Grant realized with a horror that chilled his blood that the hitman was not a random stranger. He was sent by someone who knew exactly where they were, and that meant the danger was coming from inside his own house. Grant Sterling stood amidst the scattered books and broken silence of the library, his chest heaving as the adrenaline of the attack began to fade into a cold dread. He looked down at the gun on the floor, and then up at Aaliyah, who was calmly adjusting the cuffs of her emerald blazer. He asked her with a trembling voice who would want him dead inside a library in Harlem. Aaliyah looked at him with a pity that cut deeper than her anger. She told him that he was asking the wrong question. He should be asking who had the most to gain if he never made it back to the penthouse tonight. Grant shook his head, refusing to believe the implication, but Aaliyah did not give him space to deny it. She pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped the screen, her face illuminated by the harsh blue light. "You think your fiancé is just a spoiled socialite?" Aaliyah said, her voice low and steady. "You think she is just worried about wedding venues and shoes. But you are wrong. She has been securing her exit strategy for months, and she is not doing it alone." Aaliyah pressed play on a recording file. The sound was crystal clear, cutting through the quiet library air. It was Tiffany's voice, unmistakable and sharp, but she was not speaking to a wedding planner. She was speaking to Arthur Pence, the chief legal counsel of Sterling Global, the man Grant had trusted with his life and his fortune for 10 years. Grant felt the blood drain from his face as he listened. The recording began in English with Tiffany complaining about how long Grant was taking to die. Then it switched seamlessly into a rapid-fire French as Arthur Pence assured her that the prenuptial agreement had been altered to bypass the board of directors. Grant leaned against a bookshelf, his legs feeling weak. He had thought Arthur was his loyal bulldog, but on the tape the lawyer sounded like a lover conspiring in the dark. Aaliyah swiped to the next file. This one was in Italian, a hushed conversation recorded in the back of a limousine. Tiffany was laughing about how easy it was to manipulate Grant, while Arthur described exactly how they would liquidate the company's assets once Grant was out of the picture. "They thought they were being clever," Aaliyah explained, her eyes locking onto Grant's. "They switched languages every time they discussed the timeline of your death, thinking that no one in the service staff could understand them. They spoke German when they planned the cyber attack to distract you, and they spoke Portuguese when they hired the man who just tried to kill us. But they forgot one thing. They forgot that the woman pouring their wine speaks every language they use to hide their sins. I was there, Grant. I was filling their glasses while they plotted your funeral, and they didn't even lower their voices because to them I was just furniture." Grant slid down the bookshelf until he hit the floor, sitting among the ruins of his reality. He realized that the only person in the world who had been honest with him was the woman he had arrested. His fiancée and his lawyer were sleeping together in his bed and planning his murder in his own boardroom. Aaliyah stepped closer and looked down at him. She told him that he had two choices. He could continue to play the victim and wait for the next hitman to finish the job, or he could stand up and help her burn them both to the ground. Grant looked up, his eyes filled with a new kind of fire. The betrayal had shattered his heart, but it had cleared his vision. He reached out and took the phone from her hand, holding the evidence that would save his life. He was ready to stop speaking the language of a victim and start speaking the language of war. Grant Sterling had never carried a box in his life, unless it contained a watch worth more than a car, but today he was hauling crates of bottled water up 3 flights of stairs, in a tenement building with no elevator. Aaliyah had made the terms of their new alliance very clear. If he wanted her help to take down Tiffany and save his company, he had to spend 24 hours living inside the world he had tried to bulldoze. He was not the CEO today, he was the assistant, and for the first time in his life, he was completely invisible. He stood in the hallway of the Harlem Legal Aid Clinic, wiping sweat from his forehead, while Aaliyah sat at a folding table in the center of the room, commanding the space like a queen. Grant watched as a line of people wrapped around the block waiting to speak to her. There were Haitian grandmothers clutching eviction notices and Senegalese street vendors holding unfair citation tickets. Aaliyah switched between Creole, French, and Wolof with a fluid grace that left Grant mesmerized. She was not just translating words, she was translating hope. She listened to their stories with a patience Grant had never possessed. When an elderly woman began to cry because she could not understand the confused legal jargon of a government letter, Aaliyah held her hand and explained it softly until the fear left the woman's eyes. Grant stood in the corner holding a clipboard and felt a lump form in his throat. He realized that for years he had looked at these people as numbers on a spreadsheet or obstacles to his development plans. He had never seen them as mothers and fathers fighting to survive in a system designed to crush them. Aaliyah snapped her fingers and pointed to a stack of files. Grant Sterling, the man who moved billions with a phone call, sat down on a plastic chair and began organizing paperwork for pro bono immigration cases. His back ached, and his ego was bruised, but as the hours passed, something shifted inside him. He saw a letter from Sterling Global in one of the files. It was a demolition notice for a local bakery, a place that had stood for 50 years. Grant read the cold corporate language he had likely authorized himself, and felt a wave of shame so hot it burned his skin. He looked at the baker sitting across the room, a man with flour on his hands and worry etched into his face. Grant realized that his signature was the weapon that was destroying this man's life. By the time the sun went down, Grant was exhausted in a way he had never felt before. It was not the mental fatigue of a board meeting, it was the deep soul-heavy exhaustion of witnessing struggle. Aaliyah finally stood up and packed her bag, signaling that the day was over. Grant walked her to the door, but he did not walk ahead of her this time. He held the door open and waited. He looked at her and admitted that he had no idea how she did this every day. He told her that he had spent his life building towers to look down on the world, but she was the one holding the world up on her shoulders. For the first time, Grant did not see Aaliyah as a waitress or an enemy, or even a partner. He saw her as a leader, and he realized that if he wanted to be a great man, he had to stop acting like a boss and start acting like a human being. The billionaire had finally learned the one language money could not buy: the language of humility. The storm outside was battering the windows of the Sterling estate, but the silence inside the forbidden West Wing was far more terrifying. Grant Sterling stood before the heavy oak doors of his late father's private sanctuary, a room he had been banned from entering since he was a boy. He felt a cold sweat trickling down his back, not just because they were breaking and entering, but because he was terrified of what they would find. Aaliyah stood beside him holding a flashlight, her presence steady and grounding in the dark hallway. She told him that the truth is often hidden in the places we are most afraid to look. Grant took a deep breath and used a hidden key he had found in the secret files to unlock the door. The room smelled of old leather and stale cigar smoke, a scent that instantly brought back memories of a man who ruled his family with fear. They moved through the shadows, their flashlight beams cutting through the dust motes dancing in the air. Grant went straight to the large portrait of his father hanging behind the desk. He knew there was a wall safe behind it, but he had never known the combination. He tried his birthday, then his father's birthday, but the mechanism remained locked. Aaliyah stepped forward and shined her light on the brass plaque at the bottom of the portrait. It bore a Latin inscription that translated to, "Loyalty is the only currency." She looked at Grant and told him that his father was a man of irony. She suggested typing in the word betrayal in Latin. Grant hesitated, then turned the dial. The tumblers clicked into place with a heavy thud, and the safe door swung open. Grant reached inside, his hand shaking as he pulled out a sealed envelope made of thick yellowed parchment. It was not just a deed or a bank statement. It was the original last will and testament of William Sterling Sr., dated 2 days before he died. Grant tore open the seal and began to read the handwritten script. His knees buckled and he had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from falling. The document detailed a confession. It admitted that the initial capital used to launch Sterling Global did not come from family wealth, but from a silent partnership with Marcus Robinson, Aaliyah's grandfather. The deal was supposed to be a 50-50 split of all future assets, but when the company exploded in value, Grant's father had buried the contract and destroyed the Robinson family to keep the fortune for himself. Grant looked up at Aaliyah, his eyes wide with horror and a strange sense of relief. He told her that she did not just own the land in Harlem. According to this document, the Robinson family owned 51% of Sterling Global. Grant realized that he had spent his entire life acting as the prince of the city, but he was actually just the steward of her empire. Aaliyah took the paper from his hand and read the words that validated generations of her family's suffering. She did not smile in triumph. She looked at the signature and whispered that justice has a funny way of showing up late, but it always arrives. The power dynamic in the room had shifted permanently. Grant was no longer the billionaire saving the waitress. He was the employee standing in front of his rightful boss. They stood there in the dark, knowing that this piece of paper was a nuclear bomb that would blow their entire world apart, and they were ready to light the fuse together. The rain outside had turned into a deluge, but inside the grand foyer of the Sterling estate, the air was dry and hot with sudden violence. Grant and Aaliyah stepped out of the shadowed hallway, clutching the yellowed parchment that held the power to rewrite history. They expected to make a run for the car, but instead they walked straight into a trap that had been set with military precision. The floor-to-ceiling windows were suddenly illuminated by blinding floodlights from the courtyard, and the heavy front doors were kicked open. Tiffany Vance stood in the center of the room like a commander of a dark army. She was no longer pretending to be the weeping victim. She was flanked by four men who looked less like security guards and more like executioners, their suits tight across broad shoulders and their eyes dead and cold. Tiffany held her hand out, her palm open and demanding. She screamed that the game was over and ordered Grant to hand over the document before she burned the entire house down with them inside. She told them that nobody would miss a disgraced billionaire and a lying waitress in a tragic fire accident. Grant looked at the woman he had almost married and felt a wave of nausea. He realized she had been planning this contingency from the moment she felt her control slipping. He tightened his grip on the will, refusing to move. Aaliyah stepped forward, her presence filling the room with a quiet intensity. She told Tiffany that the paper in Grant's hand proved that the Sterling Empire was built on stolen ground and no amount of threats could change the truth. Tiffany's face twisted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. She signaled to her men, and the terrifying sound of safety catches clicking off echoed off the marble walls. 4 semi-automatic pistols were raised in unison, all of them aimed directly at Aaliyah's chest. Tiffany gave the order to take the shot if Aaliyah made even one sudden move. The lead guard leveled his weapon, his finger tightening on the trigger. Time seemed to suspend in the cold air. Grant looked at the gun, and then at Aaliyah, the woman who had fought for him in the library and cleaned up his mess in the boardroom. He realized that for the first time in his life, he had the chance to protect something real. Without a second of hesitation, Grant threw himself in front of Aaliyah, covering her body with his own. He stood squarely in the line of fire, his chest acting as a human shield against the bullets. He stared down the barrel of the gun and shouted for them to stand down. His voice boomed with an authority that shook the chandeliers. He screamed that if they wanted to kill the true owner of Sterling Global, they would have to shoot the CEO first. The guards hesitated. They were paid killers, but killing one of the most famous men in New York on his own property was a complication they were not ready for. Tiffany shrieked at them to fire anyway, her voice cracking with desperation. But Grant did not flinch. He stared straight at Tiffany and told her that she had lost. He told her he knew about the baby, he knew about the fraud, and now the whole world would know she was a murderer. For the first time, Tiffany Vance looked terrified, because she realized that the man she thought was a coward had finally found something worth dying for. The standoff in the grand foyer hung by a thread as thin as a spiderweb. Grant Sterling stood with his arms spread wide, protecting Aaliyah with his own body, while Tiffany Vance screamed for her hired guns to pull the trigger. The guards' fingers were twitching on their weapons, caught between the order of a madwoman and the reality of shooting a billionaire. But before the first bullet could fly, the heavy double doors of the estate exploded inward with a force that shook the crystal chandeliers. It was not the polite knock of a visitor, it was the thunderous entry of justice. A swarm of tactical officers in heavy body armor flooded the room like a dark tide, moving with a precision that made Tiffany's private security look like amateurs. The air was instantly filled with the deafening shouts of police commands, ordering everyone to drop their weapons and get on the ground. Red and blue strobe lights from a dozen cruisers cut through the rain outside, painting the marble walls in chaotic flashes of violence. The mercenaries realized instantly that their paycheck was not worth a life sentence, and they dropped their guns, sliding them across the floor with their hands raised high. Tiffany Vance stood alone in the center of the room, her face twisting from rage to a mask of terrified confusion. She tried to pivot instantly back to the role she played best, which was the victim. She rushed toward the lead detective, tears already streaming down her cheeks, screaming that Grant had lost his mind and that this woman was holding her hostage in her own home. She pointed a trembling finger at Aaliyah, demanding that the officers arrest the intruder immediately. But the detective did not look at Tiffany. He walked straight past her, ignoring her expensive perfume and her crocodile tears. He stopped in front of Aaliyah Robinson and gave her a respectful nod that sucked the air right out of Tiffany's lungs. Aaliyah stepped out from behind Grant, adjusting her emerald jacket with the calm dignity of a woman who had already won the war before the first battle was fought. She handed the detective the yellowed will they had found in the safe, but she also handed him something else. It was her phone, which displayed a live upload status bar that had just hit 100%. She turned to Tiffany and spoke with a voice that was smooth and cold. She told Tiffany that she had not just been recording their conversations, she had been live streaming every piece of data directly to a secure server at the district attorney's office. The detective turned to Tiffany and pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. He announced that she was under arrest, not just for the attempted murder of Aaliyah Robinson and Grant Sterling, but for 18 counts of industrial espionage and wire fraud. He explained that the audio files Aaliyah provided matched the voice prints found on the encrypted channels used to sell Sterling Global secrets to foreign competitors. The blood drained from Tiffany's face, leaving her looking pale and ghostly. She tried to stammer a denial, she tried to use her social connections, and she even tried to offer the officers a bribe right there in the open. But the detective only tightened the cuffs around her wrists, the metal clicking shut with a sound of finality that echoed through the massive house. Grant watched in stunned silence as the woman he had almost married was read her rights. He saw the real Tiffany for the first time, stripped of her glamour and her lies. She was kicking and screaming as they dragged her toward the door, shouting threats that sounded empty and pathetic. As she passed Aaliyah, she spat out a curse, calling her a nobody from the gutter. Aaliyah did not flinch. She leaned in close enough so only Tiffany could hear and whispered that the gutter is where real things grow and the penthouse is just a cage with a view. She told Tiffany to save her voice because she was going to need it to explain to a jury why she tried to kill the rightful owner of the company she wanted to steal. The room began to clear as the officers hauled Tiffany and her goons out into the rainy night. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was clean. The toxicity that had poisoned the Sterling estate for years had been dragged out in handcuffs. Grant looked at Aaliyah, who was standing amidst the wet footprints and the scattered debris. She looked tired, but she stood tall, her shoulders back and her head high. Grant realized that she had not just saved his life, she had saved his soul. He had spent his life thinking power came from fear and money, but he learned tonight that true power comes from the truth. The sirens wailed in the distance, fading away like a bad dream, leaving Grant and Aaliyah standing together in the ruins of the old world, ready to build something new. The red and blue lights of the police cruisers finally faded into the distance, leaving the grand foyer of the Sterling estate in a heavy quiet. Grant Sterling let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 2 days. He slumped against the marble pillar, his expensive suit ruined and his body aching, but a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He looked at Aaliyah Robinson, who was standing by the window watching the rain wash away the chaos of the night. Grant felt a surge of gratitude and a strange new camaraderie. He walked over to the wet bar in the corner and poured 2 glasses of amber scotch. He turned to her with a look of genuine relief and told her that they made a hell of a team. He said that once the dust settled and the lawyers cleared up the mess with the will, he would make sure she was compensated. He offered her a seat on the board and a salary that would make headlines. He thought he was being generous. He thought he was offering a queen a seat at the king's table. Grant extended the glass toward her, his hand steady now that the threat of Tiffany was gone. But Aaliyah did not turn around. She did not reach for the drink. She stood with her back to him, her reflection in the dark window looking like a specter of judgment. When she finally turned, Her face was not soft with relief, it was carved from stone. She walked past the drink he offered and reached into her slim leather portfolio, pulling out a single document bound in a blue legal cover. She placed it gently on the mahogany table between them. The sound of the paper hitting the wood was softer than a whisper, but it hit Grant's ears like a thunderclap. Grant looked at the document and then at her, confused by the shift in the atmosphere. He asked her what it was, assuming it was a witness statement, or perhaps the original deed to the Harlem property. Aaliyah told him to read it. Her voice was devoid of the warmth he had heard in the library. It was the voice of the linguist, the expert, the woman who dissected meaning for a living. Grant picked up the paper and his eyes scanned the header. Notice of debt acquisition and restructuring of assets. He frowned, reading the dense legal text. It stated that a holding company called Shadow Corp had purchased the entire outstanding debt of Sterling Global. Grant laughed nervously. He told her that this was impossible because his company debt was secured by the highest-rated banks in the world. Aaliyah stepped closer, her heels clicking on the marble floor. She explained that when the courts froze his assets based on the land dispute, his company credit rating plummeted to junk status within hours. The banks panicked. They wanted to offload the toxic debt immediately to anyone with cash on hand. She told him that while he was busy playing the victim and running from hitmen, she was on the phone with the Al Maktoum Group, the same investors he had insulted. They provided the capital, but the entity that bought the debt belongs to her. Grant dropped the paper, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He realized what this meant. He looked at Aaliyah with a horror that went beyond financial ruin. "You bought my debt," he whispered, his voice cracking. Aaliyah nodded slowly. She told him that in the world of high finance, the person who holds the debt holds the leash. She explained that since Sterling Global was currently insolvent and unable to pay its creditors, she had the legal right to convert that debt into equity. She was not asking for a seat on the board, Grant. She was informing him that she now owned the board. This was a hostile takeover executed with the precision of a sniper shot while he was looking the other way. Grant felt the room spinning. He had thought he was safe. He had thought the villain was Tiffany, and that once she was gone he would return to his throne. But he realized now that Aaliyah was never his sidekick. She was a grandmaster playing a game he didn't even know had started. He looked at the woman he had once ordered to clean his shoes. He saw the irony burning in her eyes. He had used his power to try and crush her family, and now she used his own financial failure to buy his legacy for pennies on the dollar. Aaliyah walked over to the fireplace and warmed her hands, looking at the flames. She told him that he still had a role to play if he wanted it. She needed a CEO to manage the day-to-day operations, someone who knew the systems and the staff. But he would answer to her. He would report to her office in Harlem. He would ask for permission to sign checks. And he would never ever speak down to a human being again. Grant looked at the Scotch glass on the table, the symbol of the celebration he never got to have. He realized that the empire of Grant Sterling was dead. He was now just an employee in the empire of Aaliyah Robinson. He looked at her and saw the new reality. He had been saved from a bullet only to be captured by a contract. And for the first time in his life, he had absolutely no words left to say. The ink was barely dry on the contract that signed away Grant Sterling's life, but the real payment was just beginning. He stood in the middle of the executive office that used to belong to his father, waiting for his new boss to give him his first assignment. He adjusted his tie, expecting to be sent to the basement to sort mail, or perhaps to a satellite office in the middle of nowhere. But Aaliyah Robinson did not look up from her desk. She simply tossed a set of keys toward him and told him to drive. Grant felt a flicker of hope, thinking maybe she needed him to consult on a property deal because despite everything, he was still a real estate genius. He drove them through the city in silence, the tension in the car thick enough to choke on. When he pulled up to the curb, his stomach dropped. They were not at a construction site. They were parked directly in front of Lumiere Manhattan, the five-star restaurant where he had tried to destroy her life just a few days ago. Grant turned to her with a nervous laugh, asking if she wanted to celebrate her victory with a meal. Aaliyah looked at him with eyes that held no humor, only a terrifying clarity. She told him that he was not there to eat. She led him through the service entrance, the back door that he had never walked through in his entire life. The kitchen was a chaotic symphony of shouting chefs, clanging pans, and steam. The air smelled of roasted garlic and intense pressure. Aaliyah walked straight to the manager, who looked at Grant with wide eyes and handed her a bundle of white fabric. She turned to Grant and shoved the bundle into his chest. It was not a suit. It was a busser's uniform, the same stiff white jacket and long apron that she had worn the night he humiliated her. Grant recoiled as if the fabric were burning his skin. He told her that this had to be a joke and that he was the former CEO of a multinational corporation, not a servant. Aaliyah stepped into his personal space, her voice dropping to a whisper that cut through the kitchen noise. She told him that he knew nothing about leadership because he had never served anyone but himself. She reminded him that he had looked her in the eye and told her she was worth nothing because of her uniform. Now he was going to learn exactly what that uniform weighed. She gave him a simple choice. He could put on the apron and work a double shift to prove he had the humility to rebuild his company. Or he could walk out that door and she would liquidate Sterling Global by morning, leaving his family name with nothing but ash. Grant stared at the apron in his hands. His pride was screaming at him to run, but the reality of his failure rooted him to the spot. He went into the cramped locker room and stripped off his $4,000 Italian suit. He buttoned the stiff white jacket, which felt tight across his shoulders, and tied the apron around his waist. When he looked in the cracked mirror, he didn't see a billionaire. He saw a nobody. He walked out onto the floor and the humiliation hit him like a physical blow. The dining room was filled with the same high society crowd he used to drink with. He saw business rivals and former friends sitting at the tables laughing and eating. He kept his head down, praying he would be invisible. Aaliyah did not let him hide. She assigned him to the busiest section of the room. His hands shook as he poured water and cleared plates. He felt the heat rising in his cheeks every time a customer snapped their fingers at him or ignored his presence entirely. Then it happened. A young man in a bespoke suit sitting at table 4 dropped his napkin on the floor. He didn't pick it up. He looked at Grant and pointed at the ground with a lazy, arrogant finger. Grant froze. He saw himself in that young man. He saw the same cruelty, the same entitlement, and the same blindness. He wanted to scream. He wanted to tell the man who he was. But he caught Aaliyah's eye from across the room. She was watching him, not with malice, but with expectation. Grant swallowed the bile in his throat. He slowly bent down on one knee and picked up the napkin. The floor was hard against his kneecap, the same floor where he had forced Aaliyah to clean his fiancé's shoes. In that moment of submission, something inside Grant Sterling broke, but it was something that needed to break. He realized that the dignity Aaliyah possessed was not because of her title, but because of her spirit. He stood up and placed a fresh napkin on the table, his voice quiet and steady, as he apologized to the rude customer. He worked for 8 hours on his feet, sweating and aching, invisible to the world. By the time the restaurant closed, he was exhausted in a way he had never felt before. Aaliyah was waiting for him by the door. She didn't praise him. She simply told him to hang up the apron, because tomorrow he had to do it all over again. Grant nodded, wiped his forehead, and realized that for the first time in his life, he had actually earned his keep. Grant Sterling stood in the center of the executive office, his feet aching from the double shift and his white busser jacket stained with wine and grease. He thought he had reached the bottom of the well. He thought that scrubbing floors and serving his rivals was the price he had to pay to balance the scales. He looked at Aaliyah, who was sitting behind the massive desk that used to belong to him, and asked if they were finally even. He told her that he understood the lesson about humility and he was ready to move on. Aaliyah looked at him with a gaze that was so hollow it sent a chill down his spine. She told him that he still did not understand the war they were fighting because he still thought this was about money or land. She opened the top drawer of the desk and pulled out a thick leather binder that looked worn from years of handling. She slid the binder across the polished mahogany surface. Grant hesitated before opening it. Inside, he did not find financial records or property deeds. He found medical charts, dozens of them. They were detailed toxicology reports and neurological scans belonging to a woman named Eleanor Robinson, Aaliyah's mother. Grant scanned the pages, his brow furrowing, as he read terms like heavy metal poisoning and acute chemical exposure. He looked up at Aaliyah confused. He asked her what this meant. He knew her mother was sick, but the doctors had always said it was early-onset dementia and natural organ failure. Aaliyah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city that Grant's father had built. She told him that for 20 years, the doctors lied because his father paid them to lie. Aaliyah turned back to him, her voice trembling with a suppressed rage that was terrified to witness. She explained that when her grandfather refused to sell the land, Grant's father decided to make the property unlivable. He ordered his construction crews to illegally dump toxic industrial runoff directly into the groundwater supply that fed the Robinson family home and their garden. They didn't just steal the land, Grant. They poisoned the earth beneath our feet. My mother didn't just get sick. She was murdered by a slow, invisible weapon that your father fired every single day for 5 years. She breathed in the toxins while she planted her flowers, and she drank the poison in her tea. By the time we realized what was happening, her mind was already fading, and her body was shutting down. Grant felt the room spin. He grabbed the edge of the desk to steady himself. He wanted to deny it. He wanted to scream that his father was a ruthless businessman, but not a killer. But the evidence was right there in black and white, signed by the very chemical engineers who had confessed on their deathbeds. Aaliyah walked over to him and looked him dead in the eye. She told him that she didn't become a linguist just to get a job. She mastered languages so she could travel the world and track down the shell companies and the foreign contractors his father used to cover up the dumping. She had spent 10 years building this case piece by piece while she wiped tables and played the role of the invisible servant. She told him that every time he insulted her or looked right through her, he was fueling the fire that would eventually burn his house down. Grant realized then that he was not standing in front of a woman who got lucky. He was standing in front of an executioner who had been sharpening her blade since she was a teenager. The silence in the room was deafening as Grant finally understood that the debt his family owed could never be paid with money. It could only be paid in blood and ruin. Grant Sterling felt his knees hit the plush carpet of the executive office, but he did not feel the impact. He was numb. The room was spinning around him, a kaleidoscope of mahogany and glass that suddenly felt like the walls of a torture chamber. The leather binder containing the medical records lay open on the floor like a dead body, and Grant could not tear his eyes away from the chemical formulas that spelled out the murder of a mother. For 30 years he had worshipped the ground his father walked on. He had built his entire identity around the legend of William Sterling Sr., the titan of industry, the philanthropist, the man who built the skyline of New York. But that legend was a lie. The man in the portrait hanging above the desk was not a builder, he was a butcher. Grant felt a bile rise in his throat as the horrific reality settled into his bones. His father had not just outsmarted the Robinsons, he had systematically poisoned them. Grant looked down at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably. He felt a phantom sensation like oil and dirt coating his skin, a stain that no amount of soap could ever wash away. He realized with a sickening clarity that every luxury he had ever enjoyed was paid for with Aaliyah's pain. The private schools, the sports cars, the designer suits, and the vacations in the south of France were all funded by the money saved from not disposing of toxic waste properly. He was not a self-made man. He was a parasite feeding off the decay of an innocent family. He remembered every cruel word he had spoken to Aaliyah. He had called her worthless. He had mocked her poverty. He had told her she belonged in the gutter. He wanted to rip his own tongue out. He had been standing on a mountain of corpses and laughing at the people buried beneath him. A scream tore itself from his throat, a raw, primal sound of pure agony that echoed off the cold glass walls. He ripped the expensive silk tie from his neck as if it were a noose choking the life out of him. He scrambled backward until his back hit the leg of the heavy desk, his breath coming in jagged, shallow gasps. He looked at the crystal decanter of scotch, the expensive art on the walls, and the view of the city he thought he owned. It all looked like garbage now. It looked like a crime scene. He realized that Aaliyah had not just been fighting for money, she had been fighting for the memory of a woman who was slowly tortured to death by his father's greed. And Grant had been the arrogant face of that greed for his entire adult life. He looked up at Aaliyah. She was not gloating. She was just watching him with eyes that had seen too much sadness. Grant felt a wave of shame so powerful it threatened to stop his heart. He realized that while he was playing corporate games and worrying about stock prices, she was watching her mother wither away in a hospital bed. She was holding the hand of a dying woman while he was popping champagne bottles. The contrast broke him. The psychological wall he had built to protect his ego crumbled into dust. He curled in on himself, burying his face in his hands, trying to hide from the light. He wept. It was not the polite crying of a man who lost a deal, it was the ugly sobbing of a man who had lost his soul. He felt entirely hollowed out. The arrogance, the confidence, the swagger, it was all gone. In its place was a terrified boy who realized his father was a monster. Grant looked at the medical files again and saw the dates. He realized that the poisoning was happening at the exact same time his father was teaching him how to ride a bike. While his father was playing catch with him in the backyard, he was signing orders to dump chemicals into a family's water supply. The duality of it was too much to bear. Grant Sterling, the man who thought he knew everything, realized he knew absolutely nothing. He was a fraud, a creation of blood money. He looked at Aaliyah through his tears, and for the first time he didn't see a waitress or an adversary. He saw the only real person in the room. He whispered into the silence, his voice broken and rough. I am not a king. I am just the son of a murderer, and I do not deserve to breathe the same air as you. The massive iron gates of the Sterling estate had stood for 3 generations as a symbol of exclusion designed to keep the common world at a distance. But tonight, they were thrown wide open. The long, winding driveway, which was usually lined with black limousines and security escorts, was now filled with a very different kind of procession. City buses stopped at the curb to let off passengers, and worn-out family sedans parked next to the manicured hedges. The air around the mansion, which was typically silent and sterile, was vibrating with the sound of soul music and the deep rhythmic bass of jazz that spilled out from the open French doors. Aaliyah Robinson stood at the top of the grand marble staircase wearing a simple but elegant gown that flowed like water around her. She was not waiting for foreign dignitaries or hedge fund managers. She was waiting for the people who actually made the city run. The guests began to filter into the great hall, looking up at the crystal chandeliers with wide eyes and hesitant steps. These were the invisible army of New York. There were the dishwashers from the kitchens of 5-star restaurants, the night shift janitors who cleaned the glass towers of Wall Street, and the hotel maids who scrubbed floors for minimum wage. There were the families from Aaliyah's neighborhood in Harlem, grandmothers in their Sunday hats and children in their pressed church clothes. They walked into the mansion that was built on their labor, and for the first time, they were not there to serve. They were there to be served. Aaliyah walked down the stairs and greeted them not with a stiff handshake, but with warm embraces and laughter. She told the staff she had hired for the night that their only job was to make sure no glass was empty and no plate was light. Grant Sterling stood in the shadows of the upper mezzanine, looking down at the scene with a mixture of shock and a strange, unfamiliar ache in his chest. He expected to see chaos. He had been raised to believe that these people were uncultured and that they would destroy the sanctity of his home. But as he watched, he saw something he had never seen in all his years of hosting million-dollar galas. He saw genuine joy. He saw a group of elderly women sitting on his antique Louis XIV sofas laughing so hard they were crying. He saw a man he recognized as the doorman from his own office building, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne with a look of pure peace on his face. Grant realized with a jolt of shame that he had walked past that man every morning for 10 years and never once learned his name. The banquet tables were piled high, not with tiny pretentious portions of foam and garnish, but with a feast of real soul food prepared by the best chefs in the city who were under strict orders to cook with heart. The smell of roasted meats and spices filled the cavernous room, chasing away the smell of old money and stale secrets. Grant watched as Aaliyah moved through the crowd. She looked like a queen, not because of the jewels she wore, but because of the way people looked at her. She was giving them the one thing his money never could. She was giving them dignity. She was telling them that they belonged in this palace just as much as anyone with a trust fund. Aaliyah spotted Grant lurking in the shadows and signaled for him to come down. He hesitated, feeling like an intruder in his own house, but he slowly descended the stairs. The crowd parted for him not out of fear, but out of curiosity. Aaliyah handed him a plate and told him to eat. She introduced him to a woman named Sarah, who had cleaned the Sterling Global offices for 20 years. Sarah looked at Grant and smiled a tired but kind smile, and told him that she was sorry about his father passing. Grant felt a lump form in his throat. This woman, who he had likely ignored 1,000 times, offered him sympathy despite everything his family had done to hers. The music swelled and the floor filled with dancing. The stiffness of the mansion melted away, replaced by the vibrant, chaotic, beautiful energy of life. Grant realized that his parties had been funerals compared to this. He had spent his life trying to impress people who hated him, while Aaliyah spent one night honoring people who would give the shirts off their backs to help a stranger. The Sterling estate was no longer a fortress of solitude. It had been transformed into a home for the people who had been pushed to the margins. As Grant stood there surrounded by the laughter of the working class, he realized that the house finally had a soul, and for the first time in his life, he felt lucky just to be invited. The last notes of the jazz band were fading into the high ceiling of the ballroom, and the laughter of the guests was drifting out into the cool night air. The party that had turned the Sterling estate upside down was coming to an end, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy and expectant. Grant Sterling stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the empty glasses and the remnants of a joy he had only just begun to understand. He watched Aaliyah Robinson standing by the grand staircase, her hand resting on the marble banister that his father had imported from Italy. She looked tired, but her eyes were alert, watching him with that same unreadable expression she had worn in the interrogation room. Grant knew that the party was a gesture of goodwill, but it did not erase the past. It did not bring her mother back, and it did not undo the years of poison and lies. He walked toward her, his steps echoing on the floor. For the first time in his life, he was not walking with the swagger of a man who owned the room. He was walking with the hesitation of a man entering a sacred space he did not belong in. When he reached her, he did not offer a handshake, and he did not try to make a joke to break the tension. He looked at the woman who had stripped him of his vanity and his fortune, and he realized that he had nothing left to give her. He had no money to bribe her with and no power to threaten her with. He only had himself, and for the longest time, that had not been enough. Grant took a breath that shook in his chest and slowly lowered himself toward the ground. He did not kneel like a knight expecting an honor, and he did not kneel like a proposal. He sank to both knees on the hard stone floor, bowing his head until he was looking at the hem of her dress. Aaliyah took a step back, surprised by the sudden motion. She had seen men beg for their lives, and she had seen men beg for money, but she had never seen a Sterling beg for forgiveness. She waited for him to speak, expecting him to plead for his job or ask for a percentage of the company back. But when Grant opened his mouth, the sounds that came out were not English. He spoke in a low, rasping voice, struggling to form the syllables of a language that was foreign to his tongue. It was the ancient Yiddish dialect she had used at the police station, the secret language of her family, that he had once mocked as the noise of the uneducated. He had spent the last 48 hours with a translation dictionary and audio recordings practicing these words until his throat was raw, because he knew that apologizing in his language would mean nothing. He had to apologize in hers. He began to recite the traditional prayer of atonement, but he changed the words to fit his own sins. He spoke of the theft of the land and the poisoning of the water. He spoke of the arrogance of a son who closed his eyes to the crimes of his father. The sounds were guttural and difficult for him, clashing with his polished accent, but he pushed through the embarrassment. He told her in her own tongue that he was a broken vessel, and that he had built his castle on the bones of her ancestors. He admitted that when he looked at her in the restaurant he was blind, but now he saw her as the judge and the jury and the executioner of his ego. He said the words for shame and the words for sorrow, repeating them like a mantra in the quiet hall. Grant looked up. His eyes wet with tears he refused to wipe away. He continued to speak in the dialect, telling her that he did not expect forgiveness because some things are too broken to be fixed. He told her that he was kneeling not to ask for mercy, but to acknowledge her victory. He confessed that for his whole life he thought strength was about stepping on people, but she had taught him that strength was about lifting them up. He stumbled over a complex phrase about restitution and legacy, his voice cracking with the weight of the emotion. He told her that he would spend the rest of his life working to clean the poison from the ground and the stain from her name, even if he had to do it with his bare hands. Aaliyah stood frozen, her hand covering her mouth. She had expected anger, she had expected denial, and she had expected a fight. She had never expected to hear the sacred language of her grandmother coming from the mouth of the man who represented everything she hated. She listened to the rhythm of his words, and she heard the effort and the pain behind them. She knew how hard it was to learn those sounds, and she knew that Grant Sterling would never have lowered himself to learn them unless his heart had truly shattered. It was the ultimate surrender. He was not just giving up his power, he was giving up his identity to honor hers. Grant finished the speech and let his head hang low, waiting for her judgment. The silence stretched out for what felt like an eternity. He stared at the floor, expecting her to walk away or to tell him it was too little too late. Instead, he saw her hand reach down. It was not a hand of punishment. Aaliyah touched his shoulder gently, her fingers resting on the fabric of his jacket. She did not tell him he was forgiven, and she did not tell him that everything was okay. She simply told him in English that his accent was terrible, but his heart was finally in the right place. She told him to stand up because a man cannot work if he is on his knees, and they had a lot of work to do. Grant looked up at her and saw the first crack in the wall of ice that had stood between them. He stood up, his legs shaking, and realized that he had entered the room as a bankrupt billionaire, but he was leaving it as a man who had finally started to pay his real debts. The morning sun rose over Manhattan, washing the gray skyline in a bath of pale gold light. Grant Sterling stood by the glass elevator of the penthouse he used to own, wearing a suit that was off the rack and a pair of sensible work boots. He held a plastic ID badge in his hand and stared at the photo. It did not say CEO or chairman. It read Junior Environmental Remediation Officer. Aaliyah Robinson sat at the mahogany desk sipping a cup of herbal tea, watching him with a calm, steady gaze. She had not called the security guards to escort him out, and she had not exiled him to a remote island. She had done something far more profound. She had given him a job. Grant looked up from the badge and asked quietly if this was her final decision. Aaliyah nodded slowly. She told him that firing him would be the easy way out. It would allow him to retreat to a private life and forget the damage his family had caused. But she did not want him to forget. She wanted him to remember every single day. She explained that his new role would require him to physically oversee the cleanup of the toxic groundwater in Harlem. He would not be sitting in an air-conditioned office looking at spreadsheets. He would be out in the field wearing a hazmat suit, standing in the mud, and working alongside the engineers to filter the poison out of the earth. He would look into the eyes of the families who lived there, and he would answer their questions not with corporate spin, but with the truth. Grant ran his thumb over the cheap plastic of the badge. A month ago, this would have been an insult that would have made him burn the building down. But today, it felt like a lifeline. He realized that for the first time in his life, he was being given a chance to build something real. He was not inheriting a legacy of theft, he was earning a legacy of redemption. He looked at Aaliyah and nodded a silent acceptance. He told her that he would not be late. He pressed the button for the lobby, and the doors slid shut, separating the former king from his castle. As the elevator descended, taking Grant down to the ground level where the real work began, he felt a strange sense of lightness in his chest. The weight of the lie was gone, and all that remained was the honest burden of labor. Aaliyah waited until the digital indicator showed that Grant had left the building. She stood up and walked slowly toward the floor to ceiling glass doors that opened onto the sprawling terrace. She pushed them open and stepped out into the cool morning air. The wind whipped at her dress, and the sounds of the city below drifted up like a distant ocean. She walked to the edge of the limestone railing and looked out at the empire of steel and concrete. To anyone else, it was just a view of New York City, but to Aaliyah, it was a map of scars and victories. She saw the distant outline of Harlem where her mother had withered away in pain. She saw the glistening tower of Sterling Global, which was now under new management. She saw the police precinct, where she had been humiliated, and the library where she had been hunted. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the air of a city that finally felt like it belonged to her. She felt the presence of her mother standing beside her, not as a ghost of sickness, but as a spirit of strength. She felt the weight of the last 10 years lift off her shoulders, the decade of studying in the dark, of scrubbing floors, and of swallowing her pride. She had dismantled a dynasty without firing a single bullet. She had used the truth as her sword and patience as her shield. The game was over and the pieces had been reset. Aaliyah opened her eyes and looked at the horizon where the sun was now fully awake. She spoke to the wind, her voice carrying the weight of generations. She began in English, her voice clear and authoritative, stating that justice is served. She then shifted effortlessly into French, the language of diplomacy, whispering that the balance has been restored. She looked toward the financial district and spoke in Mandarin, the language of commerce, declaring that the debt is paid in full. She turned her gaze toward the south and spoke in Spanish, the language of the people she had helped in the clinic, confirming that the truth has won. Finally, she looked up at the sky, her eyes shining with tears that she no longer needed to hide. She spoke in Yiddish, the secret language of her family, the language Grant had knelt to learn. She whispered the ancient words that meant peace has finally come to this house. Aaliyah Robinson, the waitress who became a queen, turned back toward the open doors of the penthouse, ready to start her first day as the owner of her own destiny. The city below continued to churn and move, unaware that the world had changed, but up on the balcony, the silence was perfect and complete. The story of Grant Sterling and Aaliyah Robinson serves as a powerful parable about the fragility of arrogance and the enduring strength of truth. At its core, this narrative dismantles the illusion that wealth equals worth. Grant spent his life believing that his value was defined by the skyline he owned and the fear he inspired in others. He made the fatal mistake of confusing authority with leadership and net worth with self-worth. He looked at a woman in a service uniform and saw a nobody, failing to recognize that the person refilling his water glass possessed a brilliance and a resilience that far exceeded his own. This teaches us that the loudest voice in the room is rarely the most powerful one, and that true strength often moves in silence, waiting for the right moment to speak. Furthermore, the story offers a profound lesson on the nature of accountability and redemption. For years, the Sterling Empire stood tall because it was built on a foundation of buried secrets and poisonous lies. Grant inherited this corruption, and while he did not pour the chemicals himself, his willful blindness made him complicit. The narrative reminds us that we cannot inherit the privileges of the past without also inheriting its debts. Grant's journey toward salvation did not begin when he lost his money. It began when he lost his pride. When he knelt to speak a language he once mocked, and when he put on the hazmat suit to clean the earth, his family destroyed, he finally became a man in the truest sense. Ultimately, we learn that an apology without restitution is merely sound. Grant had to physically labor to fix what was broken, proving that redemption is an active verb, not a passive feeling. Aaliyah's victory teaches us that justice is patient. She proved that dignity is a currency that never devalues, and that no amount of money can buy a clean conscience. The story challenges us to look at the invisible people in our lives, the servers, the cleaners, the quiet workers, and realize that they are the ones holding the world together. A penthouse view is meaningless if the foundation is rotting, and the only legacy worth leaving is one built on respect, truth, and the courage to make things right. If this story moved you to look at the world a little differently, share this series to remind others that true power is found not in being served, but in serving others.